The machines didn't just stop, they gasped, shuddered, and fell silent like a living thing losing its final breath. In the middle of a bright, ordinary day, the entire factory froze, and with it, every confident assumption its CEO had ever made. And standing there, in the sudden, suffocating quiet, was the one man she had dismissed just hours before, a single father with dirt on his hands. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the hidden strength of ordinary people, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Wisdom Story House. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the smallest acts of respect can change everything. The morning had started like any other for Rohan Kale. The sun had barely risen when he stepped out of his small rented house, his son Arav walking beside him with a worn-out backpack and sleepy eyes. Rohan's hands were already stained, grease that never quite washed away, marks of years spent fixing machines that no one else cared to understand. But to Arav, those hands were a symbol of strength. They were the hands that cooked his breakfast, tied his shoelaces, and stayed up late helping him with homework under a flickering bulb. Life hadn't been kind to Rohan. Losing his wife years ago had left a hollow space that never quite filled. But he carried on, not because he was strong, but because Arav needed him to be. Every day, he worked at the massive Orion Textiles factory, a place that hummed with endless noise and relentless production. It was the kind of place where people became invisible, reduced to roles, to tasks, to numbers. And then there was Kiara Sethi, the CEO. Young, sharp, and known for her ruthless efficiency, she had taken over the company with a vision to modernize everything. To her, the factory was not a living organism, it was a machine, and machines needed to run perfectly. She believed in polished appearances, in spotless offices, in people who looked the part. That morning, Kiara decided to tour the factory floor. It was rare, and when word spread, supervisors straightened their backs, workers adjusted their uniforms, and everything seemed to move just a little faster. Rohan was crouched near one of the older looms, his hands deep inside the machinery, listening more than looking. He had learned long ago that machines spoke, not in words, but in vibrations, in subtle shifts, in rhythms that only experience could translate. He could feel something was off, a faint irregular pulse that others would dismiss. When Kiara approached, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her eyes scanned everything with quiet judgment. And then they landed on him. A man with dirt-streaked hands, worn clothes, and grease under his nails. She stopped, her expression tightening slightly. In a voice calm but edged with disdain, she questioned the presence of someone so visibly unkempt handling critical equipment. To her, professionalism had a look, and Rohan did not fit it. Rohan stood up slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth that did little to clean them. He tried to explain, not with arrogance but with quiet certainty, that the machine needed attention, that something wasn't right. But Kiara barely listened. To her, it sounded like an excuse, a delay, inefficiency disguised as expertise. She made a remark about standards, about cleanliness, about how this wasn't a garage. Her words weren't loud, but they cut deeply. Workers nearby lowered their eyes. Arav, who had come by after school to wait for his father, stood frozen, watching. Rohan said nothing. He simply nodded and stepped back. And then, he walked away. It wasn't anger that guided his steps, it was something heavier. A quiet resignation. He had spent years proving himself to machines, not to people. Machines, at least, listened. Hours passed. The factory returned to its rhythm, faster now, as if trying to prove something. Orders were tight, deadlines tighter. Kiara moved through meetings, reviewing numbers, making decisions that looked perfect on paper. But beneath it all, something was building. It started with a tremor, a slight, almost imperceptible shake in one of the main looms. Then a stutter. A hiccup in the rhythm. Workers glanced at each other, unsure. Supervisors urged them to keep going. Then came the sound. A grinding, choking noise that didn't belong. seconds, one machine halted. Then another. And then, like a domino effect, the entire production line collapsed into silence. The factory, once alive with motion and sound, stood still. Kiera rushed to the floor, her confidence shaken but not yet broken. She demanded answers, her voice cutting through the confusion. Engineers were called, technicians scrambled, but no one could pinpoint the issue quickly enough. The system wasn't just failing, it was suffocating. And then someone mentioned Rohan. At first, Kiera hesitated. The memory of that morning lingered, uncomfortable and sharp. But desperation has a way of stripping away pride. Rohan was found sitting outside, near the edge of the compound, Ariv beside him. They were sharing a simple lunch, quiet and content in their own world. When they approached him, there was no triumph in his eyes, no satisfaction. Just calm. He returned to the factory floor, his presence almost understated against the chaos. As he walked among the silent machines, he placed his hand on them, one by one, as if listening. Because he was. He crouched near the same loom from the morning, the one he had tried to warn them about. His fingers traced along its edges, feeling the tension, the imbalance. And then he understood. It wasn't a single failure. It was a chain reaction, triggered by a small misalignment that had been ignored. The machine had been whispering its distress all morning. No one had listened. Except him. Without wasting time, Rohan began working. His hands moved with precision, confidence born not from theory, but from years of lived experience. He adjusted, tightened, recalibrated. He moved from one machine to another, restoring balance piece by piece. Time stretched. The entire factory watched. And then, slowly, the first machine came back to life. A soft hum. Then another. And another. Until the factory was breathing again. The relief was almost overwhelming. Workers exchanged glances, some even smiling, the tension melting away. Kiera stood there, silent. For the first time, she saw him, not as a man with dirty hands, but as someone who understood something she didn't. Someone whose value couldn't be measured by appearance or polished presentation. She approached him, her steps slower now, more thoughtful. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic apologies. Just a quiet acknowledgement, heavy with meaning. Rohan nodded, accepting it without bitterness. Because for him, it had never been about proving her wrong. It had always been about doing what was right. Days passed, but something had changed. Kiera began to see the factory differently. Not as a collection of machines, but as a living system, sustained by people like Rohan. People whose knowledge didn't come from textbooks, but from years of dedication. She introduced changes, not just in processes, but in perspective. Workers.